burning bridges. Stop.
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO is its acronym, was founded by the United States and Western European allies in 1949. It is to date, 21 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was its alleged purpose for existence, the only military bloc in the world, the largest military bloc in human history with 28 full members. It has partnerships and other agreements with over a third of the nations in the world. It has, as of last year in Libya, waged war in 3 continents. In Southeast Europe and North Africa and in South Asia, all of them nowhere near the North Atlantic area, of course. It is the greatest danger to world peace as a collective military bloc.
The NATO G8 summit is coming to Chicago in May. The mayor has decided to pass controversial measures to directly restrict our right to protest, our First Amendment rights, and we have shown opposition to that, not only in the Occupy movement, but in the labor and community groups that care for civil rights. So a couple of days before the vote was going to happen, Occupy Chicago organized a roll call to demand to put pressure on our aldermen to vote no against the sit down, shut up ordinances. We organized in Danny Solis's ward. He has a reputation to almost every time side with City Hall, with whatever the administration wants to go through. But nevertheless, we exercised our right to protest outside of his office.
What do we do? Stand up, fight back! Our civil rights are under attack! What do we do? Stand up, fight back!
So my name is Jeremy Lucero, and I'm an organizer with PADO, Pilsen Environmental Rights and Reform Organization, as well as a resident of the Pilsen neighborhood for many years. My family's lived here for about 30 years. You know, PADO is held many protests over the years to fight for environmental justice. And we recognize that environmental justice is not just about the environment, but it's about all the social economic conditions within that environment as well, right? And many of our protests that we've actually held to fight for environmental justice were held right here outside of Alderman Solis's office. We're very grateful that the alderman has recently come on board with something we've been fighting for, the Clean Power Ordinance, but that only happened, and he's become a real champion of it, but it's only happened because we were out here many times holding protests outside of his office. We had a 24-hour vigil outside of his office a few years ago to push this issue, right? So I'm really afraid that if Rahm Emanuel gets his way and he passes these laws, that the activities that PADO has been engaged in for 10 years are going to become very dangerous, right? And how are we going to advance the cause of environmental justice? How are we going to advance the cause of social justice? How are we going to advance the cause of economic justice if we do not have the right to protest? So this is very concerning to my organization. It's very concerning to the residents of Pilsen. This is a neighborhood that for 150 years has been a center of activism. The 8-hour day struggle came out of this neighborhood. The fight for unions, the fight for all kinds of workers' rights came out of this neighborhood. This has always been a neighborhood in struggle. It's always been an immigrant neighborhood and a working class neighborhood, and always been a neighborhood in struggle. If Rahm Emanuel gets his way, this whole neighborhood could feel that repression. And so I'm very much concerned about this. I really think we need to fight this. I'm hoping the alderman will, like he did with the Clean Power Ordinance, come out and be a champion to fight against this. We're still waiting to hear. Hopefully we'll hear soon. There's not much time left. The hearings are coming up very soon on this, so I hope he'll do the right thing and oppose Rahm Emanuel's ordinance.
Danny Solis and I went to school together. That was a long time ago. So I'm going to tell you a story about me and Danny from 1974. We were students at the University of Illinois Circle campus. Back in the day, there was a number of issues concerning admission of students from this neighborhood. Danny and a bunch of guys were walking across the campus, and they said to me, "Hey, want to have a little action this afternoon?" I said, "Yeah." So I started walking with them, and we ended up at the university admin building. This is the large tower at the University of Illinois. And what did we do? We barricaded the elevators, we barricaded ourselves into the lobby, we would not let the trustees out of the building. They were meeting on the top floor. We held them until, well, supposedly our demands were going to be met to have more liberal admission policies for students from neighborhoods like these. Because it was a peaceful demonstration, the university campus police attempted to force their way into the building, and we forcefully kept them out of the building. Needless to say, Chicago Tactical Squad came, beat the shit out of all of us, and politely arrested all of us, including Alderman Solis. I was hoping to bump into him today across the street for a cup of coffee and ask him to consider having Emanuel's rules applied to us in 1974 and would we even be on the street today. But of course he isn't here to remember this story. But once upon a time, Danny even stood up for folks in the neighborhood. So Danny, I'll be out looking for you to remind you of where we were when we were kids. Thanks.
At that time, they would not grant permits to the anti-war protesters. Even White House emissaries came to talk to Dan, Richard J. Daley. However, no permits were allowed. Did you see a connection there somewhere?
I think there's definitely a connection. I think that we have to keep in mind that this is President Obama's town, and that this is the Democratic Party holding this summit, NATO G8, and that they are the ones controlling the message, and we have to be aware of that. It's not a coincidence that President Obama signed indefinite detention for American citizens accused of terrorism in the United States just a couple of weeks ago. So yeah, I think there is a definite connection.
And are you expecting at these meetings tomorrow and Wednesday, are you talking to other groups? Because I know there's many other Occupy
There are
groups that
citywide coalitions already not only calling their aldermen, but organizing people to go tomorrow and on Wednesday.
You're expecting a big turnout from your groups here and other groups citywide?
Yes, yes.
On Wednesday. Vote no on Wednesday. Vote no on Wednesday.
After the press conferences organized at the alderman's office, our next plan was to go to City Hall and call a press conference explaining our position on these so-called new parade ordinances. The day after was the day when City Council was going to vote for or against them.
The right to protest and the right to free speech are under assault. And I think it should be obvious, as a member of this organization, Coalition Against NATO and G8 Foreign Poverty Agenda, or CANGATE, it seems to us quite evident, why to be opposed to the NATO G8 summit here that's coming in May. At a time when the city is closing half of its mental health clinics to save $3 million. The city is spending tens of millions of dollars to bring the elite of the global elite to Chicago. That seems like an injustice on its face right there. And we are very concerned that to simply march in opposition to this is now being threatened by the mayor and these new ordinances that will put the right to protest under pressure at any and every turn. The First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, guarantees a number of rights to all Americans. The First Amendment provides that there should be no law, quote, abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances, end quote. Now, it seems to me that right on its face, again, that should be reason enough for Chicago's aldermen to vote against these changes to the municipal code.
Hello, my name is Jeff Frank. I'm with the National Lawyers Guild, an organization which for 75 years has defended protesters on the streets. Let's be clear. The mayor tells us that these ordinances are necessary to clarify, to simplify, and to end confusion. They will do none of that. For example, one part of this new ordinance is that every sign has to be described in particularity on the parade permit. Okay, every sign in a demonstration has to be. So what happens if there's signs that are not on the parade permit? The police can issue an ordinance violation. What does this ordinance violation allow? They allow for every sign, the organizer of the ordinance violation to face a $1,000 fine. That's every unpermitted sign, a $1,000 fine plus up to 10 days in jail. Okay, so how is that not chilling our First Amendment rights?
I'm a member of the Amalgamated Transit Union, Local 241. The international vice presidents of our union could not be here this morning. They asked me, they have submitted a written protest. On behalf of the Amalgamated Transit Union Local 241, we find the attempt to restrain civil liberties abhorrent to the common good. Thank you.
If these ordinances were in place at the time my colleagues were arrested, they would have spent up to 10 days in jail with a $1,000 fine for simply providing basic first aid to peaceful protesters. Mayor, we will not be silent. While patients suffer, while our grandparents choose between food and medicine, we will not be silent while our children suffer in crowded classrooms and are unable to find jobs.
You know, we have an issue here because the issue is, what if Martin Luther King was here right now? Would the same thing be going on? Recently, we've been going around when our TCAs got laid off, and we were picketing. We had the rights of it. Right now, we have an issue, and we're looking at going around picketing again. We have custodians at O'Hare Airport that are about to be laid off, privatized, outsourced. We've had TCAs privatized or outsourced. We have supervisors of the TCAs, which makes the GA so important. Why were they laid off? But the problem with this is the proposed ordinances will serve to limit the basic rights of workers to engage in concerted protective activity.
On behalf of the 30,000 members of the Chicago Teachers Union that run schools across the city, we'd like to speak in firm opposition to the proposed changes that will affect everyone's right to free speech, assembly, and protest in the city. Yesterday, on Martin Luther King Day, the Chicago Teachers Union and a group of community partners had protests at 2 schools that are being affected by proposed closings and turnarounds, in Marquette, and also we marched to Theodore Herzl School on the west side. And all of these protests are part and parcel of what's necessary for citizenship in this country: the ability to speak out, the ability to assemble, the ability to observe First Amendment rights. Both of these protests would have been illegal under the proposed changes. We are concerned that these curtailments of First Amendment rights are not just intended for some one-off protest involving NATO and the G8, but in fact will have a chilling effect on the right of all of our people to speak out their protest and to exercise their First Amendment rights. And we call on the mayor, the aldermen of this city to oppose these changes. Thank you.
Just very briefly, I've done a line-by-line analysis of these ordinance proposals. I am also intimately familiar with the current 10-8-330, the permit ordinance. And I have to say that if these ordinances pass tomorrow, all bets are off. I have to say that if the federal government decides to nix the permit that we've already received, all bets are off. Because why should people respect the law if the law does not respect them? So I put the onus on the City Council, on Mayor Emanuel, and President Obama. If you cancel people's constitutional rights tomorrow or in the future, the onus is on you for what happens. Thank you.
It sounds like you are threatening something when you say all bets are off. What did you mean? Explain that, that's all.
How do you expect people to respect the law, which is so unconstitutional that it's totally unworkable if people want to exercise their free speech rights? That is what this mayor is pushing through, attempting to push through tomorrow. Now, I still have confidence that the people of Chicago will rise up and say, no, we don't want something that's 100 times worse than the parking meters deal because, that costs us our wallets. This costs us our civil liberties.
Yes. Are you saying that if they do pass this, you'll ignore it?
I would say that if I have to register every single sign that appears at a rally that I'm organizing, I'm a human being. I can't predict every sign that someone's going to bring 5 months in advance. I mean, this ordinance, that's just one of the worst aspects of it. The current ordinance is not great. Let me be clear. This current ordinance is not great, but what they're pushing through is the wholesale cancellation of our constitutional liberties.
On the 17th, after the press conference, there was some talk of Emanuel sort of backing off. There were also conversations that the ordinances would stay in committee, would not really go through. But on the 18th, actually, the ordinances passed overwhelmingly. As we understand, our alderman, Danny Solis, voted for the ordinances. There were some minor adjustments to them, but nothing really of significance.
After the press conference, the City Council voted on the proposed ordinances. There were several changes made to the ordinances as a result of political organizing and pressure from people in the Chicago community. One of the changes was that the provision dealing with signs and audio equipment was changed. The current ordinance requires that signs that are carried by 2 people be registered before the parade, and that audio equipment that's required to be carried by more than 1 person has to be registered before the parade. This is different than the language that was in the original ordinance, which would have required all signs and audio equipment to be registered before the parade in the permit application. These devices and signs still need to be registered in the permit application, but as I said, they must be carried by more than 1 person. Other changes include the language in the deputization of law enforcement officials section, which previously said the city had authority to deputize law enforcement officials, but currently says the city has to deputize licensed law enforcement officials. So that restricts who they're able to put on the streets as their agents. Other changes include the decision to not raise the maximum fine for the parade permit ordinance. They did decide to raise the minimum fine to $200, but the maximum fine is still $1,000.
Yeah, we're going to get a taste of it, unfortunately. We're going to have to fight it, and hopefully successfully. But we're going to get a taste of what other countries have experienced and other peoples have experienced when NATO comes into their nation through bombing, through invasion, or through a post-conflict UN resolution and so forth. What most frighteningly, of course, we see that the Rahm Emanuel administration has pushed through draconian measures against protesters for the May summits, the NATO and the G8 summit, including qualitatively advanced penalties and fines for so-called resisting arrest. There was an article roughly 2 or 3 weeks ago in Crane's Chicago Business that said that the federal government is setting in what they describe as experienced marksmen, by which I think we're safe in assuming snipers, to be present during the NATO summit. Past summits in Europe, for the most part, in Europe except for the 1999 summit in the United States, have given us a demonstration of what to expect. There will be NATO military aircraft, AWACS aircraft, flying over the city. They will certainly not be limited to American AWACS planes, but most likely Canadian and European. We'll see NATO helicopter gunships. We'll see military and federal security forces. So we'll get a taste of what a military occupied zone looks like. Which is all the more reason to demand, first of all, the summit does not occur in Chicago. And if both Emanuel and the Obama administration insist on going through with it, that we show not only Chicago, but show the world that there are forces in the United States that are opposed to global militarism. Since NATO went into the active war-making business, and that began in 1999 with the 78-day bombing campaign against the former Yugoslavia, where it bombed oil depots, population centers, apartment buildings, medical clinics, the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, which killed 3 Chinese citizens, wounded 17. It has continued on this murderous rampage. As recently as yesterday, the pro-Western president of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai, denounced the fact that a NATO bombing raid had killed 8 children in Afghanistan. We know that probably in the hundreds, most likely in the thousands of Libyan civilians were killed in NATO's bombing raids last year, which incidentally, there were a total of some 26,000 NATO air missions over Libya, almost 10,000 what are described as combat sorties. That is firing bombs and missiles, or dropping bombs, firing missiles. This is an organization now that it's up. NATO also, as of last year, April of last year, killed the captain of a Taiwanese fishing vessel in the Persian Gulf, off the coast. Sorry, not the Persian Gulf, but in the Arabian Sea, off the coast of Somalia. It also shot up a couple of Iranian fishing vessels in the same area. So this is, my estimate, Military Murder Incorporated. They are responsible for directly, the deaths of tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people in the former Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, in Libya, and other parts of the world. Almost a day, hardly a day goes by, rather, where some NATO official, like their Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen, doesn't stipulate that he will not take military action today against Syria, tomorrow against Iran, but that the world has to live under circumstances where the head of the largest and the sole military bloc in the world has to reassure country by country, day by day, as it were, that they're not going to be attacked and become the next Libya or the next Afghanistan, is a terrible indictment of the world's willingness to tolerate this sort of military blackmail.
Why does our country keep attacking small countries and expending great resources and the cost of lives are right here by the Vietnam Memorial? I was part of the protests against the Vietnam. It was a small country, and I've come to the conclusion it's because the United States and other rich European countries primarily want to control the wealth of the world and the labor resources of the world.
First of all, we know that last year the UN Security Council passed 2 resolutions, 1970 and then 1973. 1973 permitted, and it was fairly clearly stipulated, a no-fly zone over Libya, ostensibly to support the civilian population that, again, supposedly was being threatened by the government. However, immediately upon the passage of that, the second resolution, 1973, U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, arrogated to itself the right to launch 110 cruise missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles from U.S. and British ships in the Mediterranean into Libya, and then began bombing raids over the nation. Russia, China, and other countries, Brazil, Brazil and India, that had abstained from that vote, I think felt very ill-used after the fact when they saw that it was used as the justification for a full-fledged war, which lasted over 7 months. NATO, of course, took over command of the military operations against Libya on March 31st of last year, ran them all the way through to October 31st, a full 7 months, and as I mentioned, conducted no fewer than 2,600 air missions over the country and over 9,000 combat sorties. As NATO has bombed and attacked countries with various sorts of political systems, Afghanistan, we knew, was under Taliban reign at the time of NATO's invasion, U.S. and NATO invasion in 2001. However, certain other countries, Yugoslavia in 1999 had a multi-party parliamentary system. There were as many as 19 different political parties representing a far broader spectrum of political ideologies than anything we experience here in the United States. And similarly, Syria has a coalition government and a parliamentary system. Chicago, contrary-wise, has a one-party political system, as we know. Every mayor in the city for some 80 years has been a member of the same political party. The city council is last count 49 out of 50, even though aldermen don't have to declare their political affiliations, belong to that same party. And as the White House is also run by that same party, what we're seeing is an assault on democracy locally by rubber stamp decisions being made on issues of fairly vital importance, such as Chicago hosting a summit, only the second in the history of the United States, by the way, hosting a summit of the world's major military bloc and foremost war-making force in the world without any solicitation of popular input, without any real debate or democratic process within city council. So what we're seeing is autocratic government in our own country, which on behalf of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which wages war oftentimes using the cloak of supporting democracy in other countries. It's a cruel irony.